if Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore was the spark that set off the riots in Baltimore and the troubles there, there was an awful lot of gunpowder already lying around. Not just in terms of the police misconduct, but in terms of the general conditions under which people in that area of town had to live. If you look at Sandtown, the area where the incident happened in Baltimore, more than half the people there are unemployed. This is an area of town that doesn't have a single grocery store. There's not a single restaurant in the area, not even a fast food joint. So you have high unemployment, you have very few opportunities for people, and it's not surprising that there's a certain hopelessness and despair and frustration that sets in, so that when there's an incident like Freddie Gray, it lights the spark that everything goes off. The question then becomes, how do you tamp this down? How do you solve the problems that beset an area like that? How do you give people less or more hope, more opportunity, a chance to get out from under the conditions they're living in a place like Sandtown? Well, right after the riots, people thought about it. Politicians in particular thought about it for about 10 seconds and then immediately came up with their answer, which is that we need to spend more money. That we heard over and over again, we need to invest in our inner cities. President Obama said that. Congressman Cummings, who represents the Baltimore area, said that. Steny Hoyer said that. He represents Maryland in that area. I mean, constantly we heard this refrain, well, what we really need to do is spend more money because Baltimore has been neglected for years. The inner cities have been neglected for years. Poverty has been neglected in this country for years. The reality is there's very little evidence of neglect. We have been pouring money into poverty, and into Baltimore in particular, for decades. You know, if you want to go back to 1965, when Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty, we have spent $22 trillion in this country on anti-poverty programs. Last year alone, the federal government spent $688 billion financing over 120 separate anti-poverty programs. State and local governments tossed in another $300 billion. So we're spending just about $1 trillion last year on poverty. That doesn't strike me as neglect. And Baltimore, well, between 2003 and 2013, which is the last year we have complete data for, Baltimore received $6 billion in federal and state grants to fight poverty. And it received an additional $1.6 billion in stimulus money from the big stimulus program that we had, and they've spent about $1.4 billion of that $1.6 billion so far. And yet we still see 25% of Baltimoreans living in poverty. We still see the problems that beset Sandtown. We're not getting a great deal of bang for our buck. And it might be because we're throwing money at the problem of poverty rather than dealing with the things we know actually can lift people out of poverty. Number one of those is a job. You know, less than 3% of people who work full-time live below the poverty level. Yet, as we've seen, there's very few jobs available in inner-city Baltimore and in places like Sandtown. Well, one reason for that might be the fact that Maryland, and Baltimore in particular, have some of the worst tax and regulatory climates for business in the nation. Maryland has the 10th worst business tax climate in the nation and the 5th worst personal income tax climate. When it comes to small business, they're the 7th highest marginal tax rate on small business in the nation. Now, if a business is going to try to locate in an area like inner-city Baltimore, that's a high-risk venture for that business. They're only going to do that if they see a substantial opportunity for return. And the more barriers, tax and regulatory barriers you put before them before they can invest in those areas, the less likely they're going to be to make those investments. You're not going to lure businesses to high poverty, high crime areas while you're sort of piling on additional regulations and additional taxes, which is the policy that Maryland has undertaken. Second is education. We know that if you drop out of school, chances are you're going to be poor. you go on and graduate college, you're not. 25% of Baltimore students fail to graduate. The SAT scores in Baltimore are 100 points below the national average. And less than half of Baltimore students pass the standard assessment tests for high school. And yet Baltimore spends a great deal of money on education, over $16,500 per student in the Baltimore school system. Depending on how you want to measure it, Baltimore is between second and fourth highest spending big city in America when it comes to education. So we're spending money, not getting good results. Why? Because the Baltimore school system acts more like its job is to protect teachers than to serve parents and students. Maryland has one of the worst, one of the strictest regulations of charter schools in the nation. As a result, there's only some 70 or so charter schools in the whole state of Baltimore. More students are educated in charter schools in Washington, D.C. than in the state of Maryland. Parents don't even have public school choice in Maryland. If you're assigned to a district, you're essentially stuck in that district, no matter how bad the school is. If you're living in Sandtown and you're sent to a school down the street that's crime-ridden, doesn't have textbooks, the teachers don't teach, you're stuck there. You don't have the opportunity to send your kids somewhere else, let alone things like vouchers or tuition tax credits or something that really would give parents control over the students. So we fail on jobs, we fail on education, and finally, we fail on family formation. We know that one of the keys to being not poor, or one of the keys to getting out of poverty, is waiting until you're married to have a kid. Now, this is not a moral judgment, it's an economic one. You're 5 times more likely to live in poverty if you give birth without a father or without a husband than if you wait until you get married before you have children. And yet we have 2 separate policies in place that increase out-of-wedlock birth in Maryland. Number one is extremely high level of welfare benefits, often conditioned on not having a father's income in the family. And second, as we've already heard, a war on drugs that criminalizes young men, gives them a criminal record that makes it very difficult for them to get employment in the future, and also, in the words of William Julius Wilson from Harvard, makes them not marriageable. If you're a single woman in the inner city and you're looking for a husband, chances are much more difficult to find one because they can't get a job, they're not set for marriage, they're not set for families because they have this criminal record that they're tied to. And then on the other side of it, we say, okay, well, if you have a child, we'll still give you all these welfare benefits on that side of it. So it's not surprising that 2/3 of the births in Baltimore are to unmarried women, and more than half the households in Baltimore are headed by single women, which is a recipe for poverty. The simple fact is that what we've done is tried to soothe our own consciences by throwing poor people money. We measure inputs. How much do we spend? How many programs do we have? Not outputs. How many people have we gotten out of poverty? We're giving people money to make poverty a little less uncomfortable, but we're not taking steps that would actually get people out of poverty. And that would include reducing tax and regulatory businesses for businesses that want to invest in these high-risk areas, improving our school system by giving parents control over schools and holding teachers accountable, and increasing the incentives for family formation by reducing welfare and ending the war on drugs and the overcriminalization of young black men.